Mark Taylor had spent most of his adult life building things with his own hands. Retired now, but with decades of experience in residential contracting, he knew homes the way some men know their children, every creak of the floorboard, every weight-bearing wall, every crack in the foundation told a story. After leaving the stress of managing crews and clients behind, he sought something quieter, something that didn't involve blueprints drawn by someone else's vision. What he wanted now wasn't work, it was restoration. Not for profit, not for recognition, but for himself. So when he came across the aging Victorian-style home at the top of Greystone Ridge, with its overgrown yard and sagging porch, he didn't see decay, he saw potential, peace, beauty, and permanence. It was a home with bones, and he was going to bring it back to life. The property had been sitting unoccupied for nearly 4 years, ever since its previous owner passed away and the estate was tied up in probate. Mark bought it directly from the heirs, who were more than happy to be rid of the responsibility. The house came cheap, but it came with history, one of those quiet, noble presences that made you want to lower your voice when you stepped inside. Its shutters were rotting, its roof had a slight lean, and the floorboards upstairs groaned in protest when you walked, but it stood proud. Isolated on a gentle slope, surrounded by dense trees and brush, it offered solitude without seclusion. The nearest neighbor was across the road, a pristine, modernized craftsman-style home with a manicured lawn and flower beds that looked like they belonged in a catalog. Mark had barely taken possession of the keys before he saw her, the woman who lived there, standing behind her screen door with arms folded and lips pressed into a thin line. She introduced herself the second day, Karen Riley. White button-up blouse, pressed khaki slacks, clipboard in hand. She stepped over the boundary like it was an interview, not a neighborly hello. Just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood, she had said, handing over a pamphlet with a homemade-looking cover titled Greystone Ridge Residential Guidelines. Her eyes moved critically over the front of Mark's house. I know it looks like a fixer-upper now, but this street has a certain harmony. We like to keep things cohesive. I'm the block coordinator, so if you plan on making any major changes, paint, porch, exterior lighting, it's best we talk first. Mark had smiled, nodded politely, and tucked the pamphlet under his arm. He had no intention of being rude, nor of starting off on the wrong foot. He didn't mind structure, he had spent most of his life enforcing it, but something about the way she said we made him pause. He hadn't read anything about a neighborhood association in the property documents. Still, he gave her the benefit of the doubt, chalking it up to neighborly pride. The first week was uneventful. Mark moved in the essentials, tools, tarps, basic appliances, and began inspecting the house thoroughly. He made lists of what needed immediate attention, scheduled small repairs, and had 2 subcontractors visit for inspections, one for electrical, one for structural. Nothing major, but enough to ensure the work could begin in earnest. He filed permits where needed, submitted the remodeling notice to the city, and even walked over to introduce himself to 2 other homeowners on the ridge, both of whom seemed friendly, if a little hesitant. Then came the morning when the backhoe arrived. Mark had scheduled a simple excavation, nothing dramatic, just clearing away a crumbling stone path that led to nowhere and grading a section of the backyard that had eroded dangerously close to the house. The equipment rumbled up the slope around 9 a.m., and within 10 minutes Karen was outside, standing at the edge of her perfectly trimmed hedge, arms crossed, her mouth twitching. She didn't say anything, not then, but she watched. When Mark waved at her, she didn't wave back. An hour later, the operator of the backhoe shut down the engine and walked over, scratching his head. Sir, there's a lady down by the driveway. She says we're in violation of something called visual perimeter restrictions and told us we need written approval from the committee. Mark felt a flush of irritation but kept it in check. He told the operator to take a short break and walked down the slope to find Karen waiting for him at the base of the driveway. She looked pleased, but not friendly. I'm going to have to ask you to pause this work, she said. You're altering the topography. That's considered a significant change to the character of the street. As I mentioned before, we expect to be consulted before anyone begins major renovations. It's all in the pamphlet. Mark looked at her, then glanced back at the pile of crumbling stone and weeds that passed for landscaping. This isn't part of your property, he said calmly. And I have city permits. She stiffened. Permits are not the same as approval from the committee. What committee? Mark asked, still keeping his tone even. Karen hesitated for a second too long. The Greystone Ridge Community Standards Committee. It's informal, but we've been in place for years. We maintain the appearance, character, and historical integrity of this ridge. Mark resisted the urge to laugh. I didn't see anything in my purchase agreement about a committee. Because it's not about legality, she said. It's about mutual respect. We've all made sacrifices to keep this street what it is. Lady, he replied. The patience starting to wane in his voice, I've made sacrifices too. 30 years of backbreaking work to finally buy something that's mine. I'm not here to argue. I'm here to work on my home. Karen's lips curved into something between a smile and a warning. Just know that we have ways of handling non-compliance. That was the first real moment when Mark realized that this wasn't going to be an ordinary neighborly misunderstanding. That was a threat cloaked in politeness, but unmistakable. He walked away without another word, returned to the site, and told the operator to resume work. That night, after a long day of digging and hauling, Mark sat on the back porch, beer in hand, looking out over the treetops as the sun dipped behind them. The house groaned with age, but it also breathed easier, as if grateful for the attention. But the sense of peace didn't last. When he rose to head back inside, he noticed something new, an envelope wedged between the slats of his front gate. No return address. Inside was a printed page, typed in a stiff, serif font, unauthorized activity on Lot 7. Cease all earth disturbance until reviewed. Violators may be subject to civil complaint. It wasn't signed, but he knew exactly who sent it. Mark didn't sleep much that night. Not because he was scared, but because he couldn't understand why someone who didn't own his land, didn't hold any official position, and didn't have a single legal document to back her up could think she had the authority to halt his work. But deep down, he knew the answer. Because sometimes power doesn't come from a title. It comes from persistence, manipulation, and intimidation. Karen Rayleigh had carved out a role for herself on this quiet ridge. Not an elected one, not even a requested one. But she wore it like a badge, and now she was determined to use it against him. What he didn't know, what he couldn't yet know, was that she hadn't even started. The morning after the envelope appeared in his gate, Mark stood at his kitchen sink, staring out the window, hands resting on the edge of the counter as if anchoring himself. The sky was overcast, thick clouds pressed low, and the air felt strangely heavy, like it was holding something in. Nothing moved outside, no breeze, no birds, not even the usual creaking of the trees. The silence was not peace, it was a warning. He had been through enough projects to know when tension was building, but this time, the pressure wasn't coming from a client or a building inspector. It was coming from across the road, behind those perfectly trimmed hedges and color-coded recycling bins, from someone who believed their authority was not only real, but absolute, and it was becoming increasingly clear that she wasn't just annoyed, she was mobilizing. When he opened the front door to retrieve his mail, he paused. His mailbox, which sat atop a sturdy wooden post he'd repaired the week prior, was leaning at a strange angle. As he approached, he saw that the screws had been loosened, the bolts twisted halfway out, as if someone had started to remove it but stopped before finishing the job. Inside were 3 letters, all addressed to him, but one stood out, a plain white envelope with no postage, just the words to the resident of Lot 7 typed cleanly on the front. Mark opened it immediately. Inside was a folded page, this time more formal in appearance, mimicking municipal formatting but clearly printed on a home inkjet. It stated, in careful language, that he was in violation of informal design covenants recognized by the residents of Greystone Ridge, and that further unauthorized landscaping or structural changes may result in collective civil action. There was no signature, no letterhead, and no reference to any ordinance or real legal framework. It was a piece of paper dressed up to look like law, but law without a backbone. He took the letter, walked back inside, and pinned it on the refrigerator, not because he needed the reminder, but because he was starting to feel the need to document everything. He knew a paper trail was going to matter, eventually. People like Karen didn't stop, they escalated. And Mark, as much as he wanted to believe this was a temporary annoyance, felt a weight settle in his chest, telling him this was just the beginning. The next sign came not from her, but from someone else, someone who probably didn't even realize they were participating. That afternoon, Mark received a voicemail from the local waste collection company informing him that pickup services to his address had been temporarily suspended due to an environmental hazard reported at the site. When he called to ask for clarification, he was told that the hazard had been logged in anonymously through a community complaint portal, which allowed residents to submit issues without needing to identify themselves. The representative explained, politely but firmly, that until someone from the city's Environmental Review Board cleared the case, his home would be listed as a restricted pickup location. It wasn't the kind of thing that made headlines, but it was deeply inconvenient, and Mark knew exactly where it had come from. Still trying to process this, he stepped outside and began gathering the debris left over from the backyard work. Weeds, torn plastic bags, cracked stone fragments, all neatly bagged and ready to be hauled away, except now there was nowhere to put it. He decided to drive it to the dump himself the next day. As he stacked the bags along the side of the house, he spotted something that stopped him cold. In the dirt between the bags were scattered shards of broken glass, brown, jagged, and freshly fractured. At first he thought one of the bags had torn, but then he noticed that the shards didn't match any material he'd been using. Some still had labels on them, labels from beer bottles, not his brand. Someone had deliberately scattered them there between the bags, probably hoping he'd step on them, or his workers would. Passive-aggressive was one thing. This was inching into deliberate sabotage. 2 days later, the city inspector showed up. Not for the renovation permits, those had already been reviewed and approved, but for a nuisance vegetation complaint filed against his property. According to the complaint, Mark's lot had become a breeding ground for pests and snakes due to unmanaged overgrowth and stagnant water. The inspector, a middle-aged man with a tired face and a notepad, looked embarrassed before he even stepped out of the car. "I'm sorry to bother you with this, sir," he said, adjusting his hat. "I can see from here that your property's in better shape than half the block. But we're required to respond to every formal complaint. It's protocol." Mark walked him around the lot, showed him the new grading in the backyard, the cleared pathways, the trimmed hedges. The inspector nodded at everything, taking photos not because he needed them, but to satisfy the checklist. When they were done, he paused and looked over toward Karen's house. "You didn't hear this from me," he said quietly, "but we've had a few odd reports come from over there in the past. Always anonymous. Always borderline, just enough to trigger inspections." Mark thanked him and watched as he drove away. The pattern was no longer a theory, it was obvious. Karen wasn't just trying to pressure him into stopping the work. She was building a paper trail of false complaints, one that could be used to cast doubt on his credibility, his respect for the neighborhood, even his ability to manage his own property. Death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. That evening, after clearing the latest pile of mail and debris from his gate, Mark decided to take a walk. He needed fresh air, and he needed to clear his head. As he crossed the street and turned down the ridge's outer road, he noticed something strange: 3 houses in a row, each with small white signs planted at the edge of their yards. The signs all had the same design: a simple red border, a block of bold black text, and a seal in the bottom right corner that looked vaguely official but untraceable. The message was stark: this street is under observation. Visual integrity and historical appearance will be preserved at all costs. It didn't name him. It didn't need to. He stood there for a moment, staring at the signs, trying to gauge whether they were meant to intimidate or rally. Were the neighbors behind this? Or had Karen convinced them she was the guardian of the neighborhood's soul? The worst part was the silence. No one came outside. No one waved. No one asked how the work was going. It was as if he had already been labeled the problem. When he returned home, he found a small package resting on his porch. No return address. Again. Inside was a laminated photograph of his own backyard, taken from an angle he hadn't noticed before higher than the hedge line, maybe from a drone or a ladder. The photo was dated with that morning's date, timestamped 6:02 a.m. No note, no message, just the image like a hunting trophy mailed to its target. Mark stared at it for a long time before placing it in the same folder where he'd begun collecting the fake violation letters. He wasn't scared, not yet, but he was something worse. He was being watched, monitored, tracked in ways that weren't just about noise or property lines anymore. The final moment that sealed the truth happened 3 days later. It was a bright, cloudless morning, and Mark had resumed light work in the garage, preparing materials for the front steps. The sound of an engine idling drew his attention to the street. A delivery truck, his weekly lumber drop. He walked down to greet the driver, but the man didn't get out. Instead, he rolled down the window, leaned out, and looked uncomfortable. "Hey, are you Mark Taylor?" Mark nodded. The driver frowned. "I was told not to deliver to this address anymore. Said there's a dispute on the title, that the property's under investigation." Mark's blood ran cold. "Who told you that?" The driver shrugged, clearly just a cog in a much bigger machine. "Dispatch got a call. Said it came from a community liaison." "I don't know, man, I'm just following orders." Mark stood there, the weight of that sentence sinking in. This wasn't about her disliking his porch design. This was a campaign. A full-scale, coordinated effort to undermine his ownership, his credibility, and his control of the home he had rightfully purchased. And now the damage wasn't just social, it was material. His work was being blocked, his supplies cut off, his property turned into a target through whispers and forged warnings. And he hadn't even touched the roof yet. It was around the end of the third week when Mark began to understand just how deeply Karen had embedded herself into the mechanics of the street. What started as passive interference had shifted into active obstruction. Subtle at first, and then increasingly brazen, her tactics began bleeding into the actual logistics of his renovation, slicing through his daily routine in ways that were both clever and infuriating. He kept hoping there would be a line she wouldn't cross, some limit to her self-imposed authority, but that line didn't exist. She didn't just want to be obeyed, she wanted to be unchallenged. It began with the subcontractors. Mark had worked with the same small team of independent tradesmen for years. They weren't cheap, but they were honest, professional, and didn't ask dumb questions. One by one, though, they started pulling out of the job. No shouting, no anger, just quiet phone calls that all sounded eerily similar. First, it was the electrician, who said he'd been approached on another site by a concerned community member who warned him that working on Mark's property might involve liability complications due to an ongoing boundary dispute. Then the plumber, who claimed he'd gotten a call late at night from someone claiming to be from the contractor's board, asking if he was licensed for multi-structure sewage tie-ins, which Mark's house didn't even have. It was clear someone was trying to spook them, planting false information, implying trouble, stirring up regulatory shadows, and it was working. Even the carpenter, who had been with Mark for nearly a decade, suddenly went silent. He wouldn't return calls, and eventually texted a single sentence, "Sorry, Mark. He can't risk the noise." With most of his team gone, Mark tried to salvage what he could on his own. He wasn't new to hard work. He'd rebuilt worse properties with fewer tools and less time. But something about doing it under surveillance changed everything. Every time he stepped outside, he felt it. That sensation, primal and unmistakable, eyes watching. Sometimes he'd glance toward Karen's window and catch a glimpse of movement, curtains shifting, a figure stepping back into the shadows. Other times it was more overt. She began standing on her porch in the mornings, holding a large, spiral-bound notebook, writing something down every time he picked up a tool or moved a ladder. She never smiled, never waved, never spoke, just stared and wrote. One morning he saw her walking along the edge of her property with a tape measure, stretching it across the road, as if trying to calculate some new line of encroachment. She crouched down and marked something with chalk on the pavement, numbers and arrows that pointed directly toward Mark's side. Things accelerated further when deliveries began getting misrouted. A shipment of weather-treated lumber was dropped off at a different address 3 streets over. The hardware store called him, apologizing and saying that someone had called pretending to be Mark and changed the drop location due to access issues. Another order, a pallet of insulation, was returned to sender after a neighbor reported it as illegally dumped material. Mark tried to trace the calls but hit a wall of disclaimers and shrugs. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was happening. The final straw came when a temporary fence he had installed around the perimeter of the backyard meant to keep animals and debris out during foundation work was mysteriously taken down overnight. Not vandalized. Removed. Every post pulled cleanly, stacked neatly, and left leaning against the base of a nearby tree. No mess, no footprints, just eerie precision. Someone wanted to send a message, but didn't want to be charged with destruction. It was control, not chaos. He finally called his lawyer, not because he thought a lawsuit would magically solve everything, but because it was time to draw a line of his own. His lawyer, a measured and highly capable woman named Lindsay Burke, listened to the entire situation with a calm, skeptical ear. She asked for every document he had, every piece of mail, every anonymous note, and then started making her own calls. Within 48 hours, she confirmed what Mark had already suspected. Karen had no legal authority, no official status, no binding documents, and no real connection to any recognized civic board. There was no Greystone Ridge Committee listed in the city's database. No active HOA. The so-called community guidelines Karen kept referencing were completely voluntary and outdated, having last been revised 15 years ago by a group that had since disbanded. Legally, Karen was nobody. But socially, she had managed to build a kingdom out of fear. She's doing what's called assumed governance, Lindsay had explained over the phone. She creates the appearance of authority through volume, speed, and confidence. Most people don't question it because they don't want the headache. She counts on that. But what she's doing now, tampering with mail and impersonating regulatory officials, that crosses into criminal territory. We're going to document everything. No emotion. No confrontation. Just facts. That's what brings people like this down. Mark began compiling a timeline. He photographed everything. The moved fence, the signs, the chalk marks on the road, the envelopes. Lindsay filed formal complaints where appropriate and requested that a community mediator be assigned to the case. The city wasn't fast, but once a legal file started growing, they tended to pay attention. Still, the damage to Mark's day-to-day was done. The worksite was in disarray, timelines had crumbled, and his energy was beginning to fade. But what struck him hardest was not the interference itself, it was how calculated it all felt. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting attempt to install temporary scaffolding by himself, Mark sat on the porch with a cold drink and tried to make sense of the spiral he was caught in. That was when a package van pulled up and parked across the street. The driver didn't get out. Instead, a woman middle-aged with dark sunglasses and a clipboard stepped out from the passenger side and began walking toward Karen's house. She wasn't delivering anything. Mark watched as Karen opened the door before the woman even knocked. The two spoke briefly, then stepped inside. The door closed behind them. 20 minutes later, the woman exited alone and drove away. Later that evening, a new sign appeared in Karen's yard. Professionally printed, bolted to 2 posts, and lit by solar-powered lights, this property is under neighborhood oversight. Unauthorized construction may be recorded and reported. It looked official. It wasn't. Mark walked over to inspect it closer and noticed something bizarre. It had a QR code printed in the corner. When he scanned it with his phone, it opened a website with a password-protected login page titled Greystone Community Compliance Portal. He didn't have access, but someone had gone to the trouble of building an entire online facade to reinforce this illusion of control. That was more than just obsession. That was infrastructure. Mark emailed Lindsay everything he had, including photos of the sign, a screen recording of the QR code behavior, and a detailed account of the unknown woman's visit. Lindsay responded with a single line: "She's scaling the operation." That's not good. Be alert. Do not engage. But Karen didn't care about legal boundaries, especially now that she knew she'd gotten under his skin. The next morning he found something new waiting at his door, taped to the glass, centered like a war trophy. It was a copy of a complaint filed with the county assessor's office, claiming that his construction was altering drainage flow and posing a flood risk to neighboring properties. It was signed by Karen Riley, Community Oversight Coordinator. The title didn't exist. The position wasn't real. But the complaint had been processed and marked under review, which meant more delays, more inspections, and more leverage for her. That was when the messages started showing up on his truck. At first it was just smudges on the windshield. Then a few muddy handprints on the side mirror. Then one morning, written in thick dust across the hood, the words, "We see you." Mark didn't flinch. He took photos, wiped it clean, and added it to the file. He didn't tell Lindsay about that one. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because it felt too theatrical. Or maybe because, somewhere deep down, it unnerved him more than he wanted to admit. The following evening, after another day of stalled progress and unanswered supplier calls, Mark heard the distinct sound of shovels hitting dirt. He stepped outside and saw, across the street, Karen and a young man, late 20s maybe, athletic, unfamiliar, digging along the edge of her property. They were laying some kind of low border fence, but what struck him was the angle it curved inward, toward the street, bending subtly in his direction. It was visual manipulation, designed to create the illusion that the property line extended farther than it did. As he watched, Karen turned her head slowly and looked at him directly. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just stared. That night, Mark slept with the porch light on. He was beginning to understand something he hadn't wanted to admit. She wasn't trying to stop his renovation. She was trying to unseat his ownership, to remove him, not through force, but through the slow erosion of perception and position, one cut at a time. The shift came not with a bang, but with the hollow quiet of a dead morning. Mark had awoken earlier than usual, his sleep disturbed by a dream he couldn't quite recall, only the feeling of it remained. A restless disorientation that clung to his skin like a cold sweat. He made coffee on autopilot, waiting for the smell to bring him fully into the day, and stood by the front window watching the mist roll over the trees like it was a living thing. The house was colder than normal, and even after turning the heater on, the chill refused to leave his bones. He chalked it up to fatigue, but somewhere deeper, he knew better. There was a pressure in the air, the kind that signals a storm, even if the skies are blue. That storm arrived by mail. A plain manila envelope, hand-delivered, no postage, no return address, just to Mr. Mark Taylor, written in neat black ink. Inside, a notice far more professional-looking than any of the earlier scare tactics. This one bore a city letterhead, real signatures, and a formal tone that immediately set it apart from Karen's forged attempts. It was a municipal mediation request, filed not by the city but by a resident. Karen Riley had formally requested a mediated review of ongoing conflicts and violations of community cooperation standards. It wasn't legally binding, but it was the kind of document that sat heavy on a file, the kind that lingered in a bureaucratic system and cast shadows on one's record, even if unfounded. Lindsay confirmed the document's legitimacy. The city, under increasing pressure from mounting noise, dozens of small complaints, citizen reports, claims of tension, had agreed to assign a mediator to the case. Not because Mark had done anything wrong, but because someone had been relentless enough to demand attention. You have the right to refuse mediation, Lindsay said, her voice calm but edged with concern. But if you do, she'll use that refusal as ammunition. She'll claim you're uncooperative, that you're a threat to neighborhood unity. This isn't about law, it's about optics now. So Mark agreed, reluctantly. He wasn't afraid of sitting across from Karen. What unsettled him was the idea that any of this was being elevated to a matter of public conflict. He didn't want headlines. He didn't want notoriety. He wanted to finish restoring his home. But now his name was in a system that didn't forget. The meeting was held in a modest municipal office in the basement of City Hall. The mediator was a man in his early 40s, polite but detached, clearly used to neighbor disputes over hedges and dogs, not power plays. Karen arrived with a black leather binder, her expression pleasant but taut, like a coiled spring. She greeted Mark with a nod, not a word, and took her seat across from him as though it were a throne. She began with practiced ease, recounting her years of dedicated service to the community, citing her role in preserving architectural cohesion, and listing grievances that, to anyone unfamiliar with the truth, might sound reasonable: unapproved changes to visual elevation, deviation from historic roof lines, improper use of construction equipment, light pollution, and environmental disruption. She spoke clearly, confidently, slipping legal-sounding terms into every sentence like she'd rehearsed them for weeks. She presented photographs, ones Mark recognized, and others he'd never seen, some taken from angles that suggested drone surveillance or even long-range cameras. She passed the mediator a printed map, overlaid with boundary suggestions and landscaping notes, color-coded and highlighted. When it was Mark's turn to speak, he kept his voice level. He provided the mediator with real documents, permits, city approvals, photographs of the condition of the home prior to any work, screenshots of his deliveries being redirected, a log of his communications with Lindsay, and printouts of the strange, unsigned letters. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply laid out the truth. When he finished, Karen leaned forward, folded her hands, and said in the sweetest voice she'd used yet, "I only want what's best for our street. But harmony requires participation." The mediator adjourned the meeting after 45 minutes and said a summary report would be filed within the week. No decisions were made. No sides were taken. But Mark knew what the outcome would be: nothing concrete. Just more noise. More fuel. More evidence that something was happening on Greystone Ridge, and where there's smoke, people assume there's fire. Karen wasn't trying to win a case. She was building a case-shaped cloud to suffocate him. That night, Mark returned home to find a thick stack of flyers stuffed into his mailbox and wedged into the crevices of his front gate. The flyers were printed in full color, clearly expensive, and featured side-by-side photos of his home, one before he began repairs, and one after, with the words, "What are we becoming?" emblazoned across the top. Below that, a quote, "Once the street changes, it never changes back." It wasn't signed, but at the bottom was a logo, a stylized crest with the initials G.C.P. Greystone Community Preservation. Another invention. Another front. For a long time, he just stood there on his porch, holding one of the flyers, letting the others scatter in the wind behind him. Then, without a word, he went inside, sat down at his desk, and began typing a new log entry. He included everything from the mediation, the quote on the flyer, the symbols, and even a photo of the binder Karen had brought. He added it to the growing file he shared with Lindsay. The more methodical he became, the more unhinged Karen's efforts appeared. That was the only weapon he had left: order. She wielded perception, he would wield proof. 3 days passed without incident. Then, early one morning, he woke to find a small pile of rocks arranged on his front steps, smooth, round, placed deliberately, stacked into a miniature cairn. Balanced, fragile, symbolic. He didn't touch it. He just took a picture. That same afternoon, one of his exterior lights went out. He checked the bulb, shattered. He replaced it. The next night, another light died. This one, the wire had been cut cleanly, not chewed, not burned, cut. On the fourth day, as the sun began to set, Mark stood at the edge of his property staring across at Karen's house. And that's when he saw it. A shape on her porch, small, covered in canvas. It looked like a garden sculpture or some kind of display. But when the wind lifted the edge of the cloth, he saw his own house rendered in wood. A model, his home replicated but half finished. The front porch removed. The siding altered. The structure narrowed. Changed. It wasn't just a model. It was a vision, her vision. Her idea of what the house should be. She had built a miniature version of his property. He turned away before she could see his reaction and went back inside. That night, Mark didn't sleep. He didn't even try. Instead, he sat in his workshop, sharpening tools not out of paranoia, but clarity. He wasn't preparing for war. He was anchoring himself in reality. Because what he now understood without a shred of doubt was that Karen wasn't simply trying to stop him from changing his house. She was trying to rebuild it through him, as if she could reshape physical space through pressure alone. And if she couldn't do that, she would drive him out and do it herself. This was no longer about a home. It was about control and perception and how far someone could go when the world around them was too polite or too afraid to say no. Mark hadn't left his house in 3 days not because he was afraid, but because the house itself had become his war front, and every hour away felt like an opening for another move. He wasn't sleeping properly anymore, not in any real sense, just short intervals of restless unconsciousness interrupted by the smallest creaks, distant car doors, and the periodic flicker of security lights catching motion that always disappeared before it registered. The paranoia that had crept into him wasn't the irrational kind, but the kind that grew from consistent, measured violations, the kind that came when you knew your boundaries were being tested every day, not with violence, but with an increasingly sophisticated pressure that couldn't be named in one sentence or even proved with a single action. Karen hadn't stopped. She had simply shifted gears, adapting, becoming more careful, more structured. Mark felt it in every part of his routine. Her attempts now were layered, as if she were orchestrating a campaign with departments and functions. It started with the inspectors. For 2 straight weeks, nearly every day brought a new one. Fire safety, soil drainage, noise level. A city utility engineer arrived one morning to inspect alleged improper gas line installations, even though Mark hadn't touched his gas lines at all. Each inspector apologized, most of them even expressing confusion over the frequency of complaints, but their hands were tied. "We get a complaint, we file a visit," they'd say almost apologetically, while scribbling on their clipboards and snapping photos. Mark stopped asking questions. He just stood back and let them do their jobs, then documented every single visit with a timestamp note and photo. Lindsay started compiling it all into a digital log, and even she sounded impressed. "She's coordinated," she said in one message. "And she's either very well connected or very good at pretending she is." That's when Karen escalated to the neighbors. Mark didn't know most of them by name. He hadn't had time to introduce himself properly since he arrived, but one by one, subtle changes began appearing on the street. The elderly man 2 doors down, who used to wave while trimming his hedges, now turned away when Mark passed. The woman who jogged past his house every morning now crossed the street as she approached. One afternoon, while walking to his mailbox, Mark noticed a group of 3 residents huddled in Karen's driveway, speaking in hushed voices as she gestured animatedly, pointing toward his house with a laminated document in her hand. They weren't hostile, but they were withdrawn, uncertain, as if unsure whether acknowledging him would bring trouble. Karen was isolating him, quietly and effectively, creating an invisible wall between him and the community. And it worked, because most people didn't want trouble. They wanted predictability, harmony, someone else to deal with the uncomfortable situations. But even that wasn't enough for her. The flyers came next, different from the last batch. These were sharper, more provocative, designed like newsletters, filled with passive-aggressive commentary dressed as community updates. Phrases like property inconsistency, disruptive reconstruction, and unregistered structural adjustments were sprinkled throughout, always without direct accusation, but always referencing a property on the west side of the ridge. Mark's house was the only one undergoing any work. She didn't need to name him. Everyone already knew. One of the newsletters included an anonymous quote from a supposed neighbor, stating, "We moved here for peace. Now we feel watched, like we're under a microscope. I worry about the kind of people being drawn to this neighborhood." Mark read it 3 times. The implication wasn't just hostile. It was surgical. He thought about retaliating, writing a response, printing his own flyers, but Lindsay shut that idea down. "That's what she wants," she warned. "She wants you to engage emotionally. If you do, she controls the narrative. Let her overreach. Keep documenting, keep your distance." So he did. Even when he wanted to scream. Even when the weight of silence made his chest feel like it was collapsing inward. Then the property dispute began. He received a certified letter from a real estate mediation firm claiming to represent Karen Relly, stating that she had newly discovered documentation, suggesting that a portion of Mark's property, including part of his driveway and a section of his side yard, had once been part of the adjacent lot, and that the boundaries may have been misrecorded in a decades-old reassessment. The letter didn't make any legal claims, but it suggested amicable adjustment or shared usage discussions, and ended with a not-so-subtle warning that refusal to address the matter could force escalation through formal litigation. Lindsay reviewed it and laughed out loud. "There's no case here," she said. "But she's not trying to win in court, she's trying to jam the gears, slow you down, make you nervous. It's psychological warfare." Mark kept building. Slower now, more cautiously, but he kept going. The porch was nearly finished, the foundation stabilized, the exterior lighting upgraded. But every step forward came with resistance. Someone had begun stealing tools from his garage, not large, noticeable equipment, but small things, bits, blades, measuring tape, nails, enough to frustrate him, to make him second-guess whether he'd misplaced them. He installed an interior motion sensor near the garage entrance. 2 nights later, it triggered at 3:42 a.m. When he reviewed the footage, all he saw was a shadow moving past the sensor and a faint scrape like someone dragging something metallic. No face, no voice, no proof, just enough to feel violated. A few days later, a city truck arrived and began digging along the far side of the street, unannounced. Mark approached and asked what was going on. The worker, friendly but clearly annoyed, explained they were re-evaluating underground utilities because someone had submitted a complaint about drainage failures affecting residential stability. Mark asked if they had a permit. They did, and it was expedited. When he asked who filed the request, the worker shrugged. "We don't get names, just order numbers." It was then that Mark made a decision not out of fear but necessity. He hired a private site security service. Nothing dramatic, no uniforms, just 2 off-duty officers working rotation, stationed inside a black SUV parked down the street with tinted windows. He didn't announce it. He didn't tell Lindsay. He just did it. Within 48 hours, the change was immediate. No more midnight movement. No more missing tools. Even the mail started arriving unbothered. But Karen adapted quickly. When Mark stepped outside to check the perimeter one morning, he saw a new sign posted in her window: "We are being watched. External surveillance present. Privacy compromised." Beneath it, smaller print read, "Some people don't belong here." The final blow in this stage came with the arrival of a legal-looking envelope bearing the seal of the Department of Permitting and Land Use. Inside was a formal complaint again, filed by Karen, accusing Mark of constructing without proper zoning clearance for a new structure. The structure in question? A shed. A prefabricated, regulation-compliant, city-approved shed that had been on the property for less than a week. She claimed it was permanent housing, citing visible signs of occupation, including an extension cord and a light visible through the vent. Mark hadn't even wired it yet. He stood there, holding the paper, staring at the accusation, stunned by the sheer reach of her delusion. She was trying to reframe the narrative now, not just that he was disruptive, but that he was deceitful, hiding something, running an operation, bringing in outsiders. Lindsay filed a counter-complaint the same day. She began assembling everything into a master file, preparing for the moment when the city would finally intervene with a cease and desist against Karen. But Mark knew they weren't there yet. Not quite. And that meant he had to endure just a little longer. That night, as he sat on the back steps watching the security SUV shift quietly in the dark, Mark understood that the game had changed. Karen wasn't trying to scare him anymore. She was trying to rewrite him. He needed to change how others saw him, to implant enough confusion and suspicion that he would either give up or become exactly the thing she accused him of. And the worst part? She was close. Not to winning, but to exhausting him beyond the point of resistance. He could feel the pull of it, the quiet seduction of surrender. Just sell the place. Walk away. Let her win. But instead he stood up, stretched his tired legs, and walked back inside to review the footage from that day. Every second she pushed harder, he would answer with evidence. She wanted chaos, he would bury her in calm, measured truth. And when it ended, and he knew now it wouldn't be a scream. It would be silence, the kind that follows a wall finally falling. It happened on a Monday, the kind of gray-skied morning where the world feels held in suspension, neither ready for rain nor sunlight. Only that muted stillness that tends to precede sharp turning points. Mark was in his workshop, not working, just existing surrounded by tools he no longer had the energy to touch. The house was nearly finished now, structurally whole, freshly painted, and quiet, but that quiet no longer felt like peace. It felt like a ceasefire. He was tired, not just in his body, but in the kind of way that rewires your instincts, makes you check locks twice and doubt the intentions behind every knock on the door. He had made it farther than most would have, but even stone weathers under enough pressure. He didn't expect anything unusual that day, which was, of course, exactly when it came. The knock was sharp, not loud, but deliberate, the kind of knock that wasn't asking to be heard, it was asking to be acknowledged. Mark opened the front door and found Karen standing there alone, dressed in neutral tones like always, holding a manila folder in one hand and a coffee cup in the other. Her expression was unreadable. She didn't step forward, didn't smile, didn't make eye contact right away. She just said, flatly, "We need to talk." Mark didn't move. About what? Or about what's about to happen? She extended the folder toward him. And how we can avoid turning this into something irreversible. He didn't take it. What is it now? Another complaint? Another map? Her face didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Not this time. Then, slowly, she looked past him, into the house. "You've gone too far, Mr. Taylor. You've refused reasonable community process. You've made yourself into a problem. Now others are involved. People above me." He stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "There is no above you, Karen. There's just you. You've made yourself judge, jury, and executioner of a neighborhood that didn't ask for a monarch." Karen looked at him in a way that made his skin prickle. "You think this is about me? I was trying to protect this place, keep it whole. But you people like you just come in and reshape things without understanding what they mean. This house belonged to the rhythm of this street before you ever touched it." Mark almost laughed. "You're not well." But she didn't flinch. She didn't deny it. She stepped back, reached into her jacket, and pulled out something he hadn't expected. Not this time. Not here. Not like this. It was a pistol. She didn't aim it. She didn't lift it. She just held it, comfortably, like it belonged there. Mark's breath slowed, not from panic but from the deep, cold recognition that this had never been about boundaries or zoning or documents. This had always been about control, and now that her scaffolding of fake authority was collapsing, she was falling back on the only real power she still had: fear. "I don't want to use it," she said, as calmly as if they were discussing garden work. "But I will, if you keep pushing." There are things you don't know about this street, about what it was built for. This property, your property, wasn't supposed to be yours. It was meant to stay in balance. You brought a gun to my door, Mark said, keeping his voice low. You crossed a line you can't walk back from. Karen's fingers tightened just slightly around the grip, but she didn't raise it. I came to offer you a way out, sign over the back lot, just the slope and the drive. You can keep the house. You can live here quietly, but the boundaries must return to their design. There is no design, Mark replied. There's only your obsession. For a moment, it felt like time stalled, like the air itself stopped moving between them. Then came the voice, sudden and cutting, a firm "A.M. Don't move," spoken from the direction of the driveway. Karen froze. Mark turned his head, and there they were, the private security officer and a city sheriff, both with calm expressions but hands hovering near their belts. Lindsay must have escalated the file. Or maybe it was one of the neighbors who finally said enough. It didn't matter. Karen didn't resist. She let the pistol fall to her side and placed it on the porch step like she was setting down a tool. Her face didn't show defeat. It showed emptiness. They took her without struggle. The report that followed documented everything: the false complaints, the impersonations, the private surveillance, and now the armed threat. Karen was removed under a restraining order and transported for psychiatric evaluation, but no charges were filed immediately. Mark didn't press them. He didn't want a legal war. He just wanted the story to be over. But stories like this never really end. The following week was quiet. Not calm, just quiet. No letters. No inspections. No new signs. The neighbors slowly began to reappear. A few offered awkward nods, fewer offered words. One man, the jogger's husband, brought over a pie and said, "We should have stepped in. We didn't know how." Mark accepted it, not because he wanted it, but because small gestures mattered. The street didn't recover, not all the way. Karen's house remained untouched, lights off, a locked silence behind its walls. Mark finished the house. He didn't celebrate. He didn't host a gathering or plant a flag of victory. He simply stepped onto the front porch one morning, coffee in hand, looked out over the ridge, and exhaled. Not relief, just breath. The kind you forget you've been holding for too long. In the weeks that followed, a letter arrived from the city. It acknowledged the complaint history, the mediation records, and the final incident, and informed him that Greystone Ridge was being reviewed for formal oversight protocols due to long-standing unregulated activity masquerading as civic governance. It was phrased with bureaucratic caution, but Mark could read between the lines they were cleaning up the mess Karen had left behind. Quietly, slowly, just like she had built it. On a whim, he walked to the edge of his property one evening and looked across the street. The sign she had posted in her window was still there, but faded now, sun-bleached and curling at the corners. Behind the glass, the lights remained off. He thought about removing it, about walking across the road, pulling it down, symbolically reclaiming the street. But he didn't. Some things were better left untouched. He turned and walked back inside. And for the first time in months, he locked the door behind him, not because he was afraid, but because the lock finally meant what it was supposed to: safety. The seasons shifted with quiet indifference. Summer browned into autumn, and the ridge, once painted in the dull greens and grays of long-standing conflict, began to soften. The leaves turned gold, the air cooled, and for the first time in nearly a year, Mark Taylor's house stood still, not under siege, not under watch, just still. The repairs were complete, the scaffolding gone, the tools stored. The new porch stood firm underfoot, the shutters freshly oiled and aligned, and the siding glowed faintly in the morning light. It didn't look perfect, and that was the point. It looked lived in. It looked his. Karen Riley's house remained vacant. The blinds never lifted. No car ever returned to the driveway. The city placed a notice on the front gate weeks ago: property under review, pending medical conservatorship and investigation of unlawful enforcement practices. Neighbors whispered theories in half voices. that she'd been committed, that a relative had come for her, that she was waiting it out elsewhere. But nothing came of it. The lights never turned back on, and over time the curiosity turned to dust. People stopped talking, and in their silence, the street breathed again. A few of the neighbors began reintroducing themselves. Mark didn't chase conversations, but when people came to him, he didn't turn them away. "The old man 2 doors down, mister." Leary brought over a bottle of scotch he'd been saving for 20 years and said only, "Should have given you this after you finished the porch. He figured you earned it twice over." The jogger and her husband started waving again. The woman who used to cross the street now nodded each morning, eyes softer. Nobody apologized directly, and Mark didn't ask them to. The damage Karen left behind wasn't only about what she did, it was about what people let happen. But that reckoning wasn't his to extract. They would live with it in their own way. That was enough. Lindsay finalized the closure of the incident file. The city issued a statement formally dissolving any assumed neighborhood oversight groups on Greystone Ridge and confirmed that no local resident had the authority to issue complaints or enforce community codes beyond city regulations. All prior documents submitted under Karen's various aliases and titles were voided, and the security presence was withdrawn. In its place, Mark installed a discreet 2-camera system of his own, not for watching others, but for ensuring he'd never again be caught unaware in his own home. He didn't become paranoid, he became practical. The shed that once caused an entire week of accusations now sat quietly in the corner of his lot, finally connected to the main system and functioning as a workspace. Inside, Mark took up woodcraft again. Not professionally. Not commercially. Just enough to feel the grain in his palms, to cut lines that served no one's purpose but his own. He built shelves, small boxes, a pair of benches. He carved in silence. It wasn't about creating anything to display. It was about remembering that not everything needed to be defended. One afternoon in November, he received a letter not from the city or any institution, but from a man who introduced himself as Karen's brother. The note was short, handwritten in unpolished script, and apologetic without being defensive. The man explained that Karen had suffered from untreated mental health issues for many years, that she had grown increasingly obsessed with patterns and structure, and that their family had struggled to intervene before it became dangerous. He thanked Mark for not pressing charges, acknowledged the damage she had done, and said she was receiving treatment under supervision. He enclosed his phone number, but did not request contact. Mark never called. He didn't need to. Some things, once understood, don't require further discussion. As winter approached, the final repair was made, a small iron plaque mounted discreetly beside the front steps. It read simply, "Built 1912, recovered 2025. No names, no credits, no symbolism for anyone but him. It was a line drawn under a long, brutal chapter. When the snow came, soft and early, it fell quietly over the ridge. The streetlights flickered gold through the frost, and the branches bowed gently under the weight. From his porch, Mark watched it all in silence, a thick blanket of stillness covering everything that had once been loud, distorted, and out of control. The wind didn't howl, it whispered. The shadows didn't threaten, they stretched and softened. He stood there long after the cup in his hand had gone cold. Inside, his house was warm. He had come to Greystone Ridge expecting solitude and found conflict. He came for peace and had to fight for it, not with fists or rage, but with patience, consistency, and truth. He had endured not because he was stronger, but because he was steady. He didn't bend when the pressure came. He didn't retaliate when it invited chaos. He responded like the house itself, weathered but unmoved. And now, standing there in the calm, in the quiet, with no letters waiting, no signs posted, no threats on the gate, there was nothing left unsettled. Karen Riley was gone. Her world of invented authority had collapsed under its own weight. The neighbors had seen it. The city had confirmed it. And Mark had survived it. There would be no more reports, no more surprise inspections, No more lines drawn in chalk. The house was his. The silence was real. And the story was over.